So initially, Donald Trump halted all trade talks over this ad going to air, but he's now lumped Canada with that additional 10% tariff. Can you just explain to us?
The government of Canada stands ready to build on the progress that we had been making in our negotiations, our discussions with our American counterparts.
Now Trump has announced 10% additional tariffs on Canada. In fact, this all started when
the announcement hit like a thunderclap. Overnight, the White House declared that all trade negotiations with Canada were being suspended indefinitely. President Donald Trump had imposed a new 10% tariff on Canadian imports, over and above the existing duties already straining both economies. His justification? Canada's anti-tariff actions are undermining American industry. What seemed like a simple policy escalation quickly turned into something much larger. Within hours, financial markets wobbled, commodity prices spiked, and cross-border shipments slowed to a crawl. Two of the world's most deeply integrated economies, suddenly on the brink of a trade standoff. But this time, Canada didn't back down. It fought back, decisively. The situation escalated with shocking speed. Insiders later revealed that the decision to cut trade ties was finalized after a confidential briefing to the National Economic Security Council. The assessment concluded that Canada's recent measures, specifically its new Buy Canadian procurement rules and selective border checks on U.S. goods, had effectively neutralized the benefits of Trump's previous tariffs. Within hours, Trump personally approved the suspension, calling Ottawa's actions a direct threat to America's economic security. Even senior officials in Washington were caught off guard. The president's late-night order came without warning to industry leaders or Congress, and yet within Canada, the reaction was swift and calculated. Prime Minister Mark Carney called an emergency cabinet meeting in Ottawa. By morning, the government announced that cross-border freight would be temporarily restricted until Washington provided clarity on its tariff policy. It wasn't an all-out blockade, but it was close. Fuel shipments, auto parts, agricultural goods, and even certain pharmaceuticals faced new inspection protocols. For the first time in decades, the seamless flow of goods between the two nations ground to a bureaucratic halt. The message from Ottawa was unmistakable. If Washington wants to play economic hardball, Canada can match it, move for move. To understand the magnitude of this standoff, you have to look at the numbers. Each day, more than $2.6 billion in goods crosses the U.S. Canada border. The two countries' economies are intertwined like few others in the world. A single vehicle assembled in Ontario or Michigan can contain parts that cross the border up to 8 times before final assembly. But Trump's latest 10% tariff threatened to shatter that delicate ecosystem. The duties applied not only to finished products but also to the raw materials, steel, aluminum, and rare components essential to automotive and aerospace manufacturing. For an industry already battered by years of uncertainty, this was a tipping point. Factories across Ontario began preparing for shutdowns. GM announced plans to idle shifts at its Oshawa facility, while Ford and Stellantis signaled potential layoffs if supply disruptions continued. South of the border, the situation wasn't much better. U.S. factories in Michigan and Ohio, reliant on Canadian components, suddenly faced production delays and cost spikes. Even agricultural exporters in the Midwest reported shipments trapped in customs as Canada ramped up inspections. The world's longest undefended border had become an economic fault line, one that threatened to collapse under the weight of politics. What came next caught even Washington by surprise. Instead of retaliating with another round of tariffs, Canada launched a coordinated economic defense strategy. Ottawa announced that federal agencies would immediately prioritize domestic sourcing under a nationwide Buy Canadian initiative, shifting billions in government contracts toward Canadian manufacturers. The move wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. In one stroke, Canada insulated its supply chain, protected jobs, and redirected economic energy inward. Provincial governments followed suit. Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec issued joint statements reaffirming the policy, while major automakers released a new slogan: Canadian cars for Canadian drivers. The message resonated. Dealerships began highlighting vehicles assembled in Canada. Consumers embraced the campaign as an act of defiance, a patriotic stand against what many saw as economic bullying from Washington. Within weeks, sales of Canadian-built cars surged more than 20%. Hashtags like Sham Buy Canadian and Stand with Canada flooded social media. What began as a trade dispute was transforming into a national movement. But make no mistake, this wasn't only about cars or tariffs. It was about power. For decades, Canada and the United States had built their prosperity on integration, a shared supply chain, mutual investments, and trust. The North American Free Trade Agreement, later replaced by the USMCA, had tied their economies so tightly that disruption seemed unthinkable. Now that assumption was crumbling. Trump's tariff campaign had already strained relationships with Europe, Mexico, and China. But this clash with Canada, America's closest ally and top trading partner, represented something deeper. It was a test of economic sovereignty. And for the first time in years, Canada wasn't content to play the supporting role. Prime Minister Carney made the government's stance clear. Canada will not be coerced into policy through economic aggression. If tariffs are used as weapons, we will respond with strategy, not surrender. That statement sent a signal to Washington and to the rest of the world. Then came the real turning point. Within days of Trump's announcement, Ottawa tightened restrictions at major crossings: Windsor, Sarnia, and Fort Erie. Customs officers conducted full-scale inspections on U.S. trucks carrying goods subject to the new tariffs. The result was immediate gridlock. Thousands of trucks backed up for kilometers, costing millions in delayed shipments. American exporters accused Canada of weaponizing bureaucracy. Ottawa simply called it due diligence. For many Canadians, it felt like justice. For the White House, it was an embarrassment. When asked if the border slowdown was intentional, a senior Canadian trade official responded carefully, "We're not closing the border. We're ensuring fair play." It was diplomacy wrapped in defiance. The economic consequences rippled quickly. Energy exports, one of Canada's largest trade sectors, saw shipments fall nearly 15% in the first month. Auto production lines in Michigan began operating at half capacity. Analysts at Bloomberg warned that if the dispute continued for more than 90 days, both economies could lose billions in GDP. Even Wall Street started to worry. Investors sought clarity, but none came. The White House doubled down, claiming that short-term pain leads to long-term strength. Ottawa, in turn, stated that sovereignty is not for sale. Behind the rhetoric, both nations quietly began assessing how far they were willing to go. As this economic standoff unfolded, a broader shift was taking place. Canada began deepening trade relationships beyond its southern neighbor, strengthening ties with the European Union, and expanding its Indo-Pacific partnerships. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, once seen as a backup plan, suddenly became the centerpiece of Ottawa's trade diversification strategy. By reducing its dependence on U.S. markets, Canada was signaling something profound: the end of automatic economic alignment with Washington. For the United States, that realization stung. For decades, American policymakers assumed Canada would always fall in line. Now it was carving its own path, and thriving while doing it. The public turns across Canada. The mood shifted from anxiety to determination. What began as frustration over tariffs turned into a wave of solidarity. Communities across Ontario and Quebec held rallies supporting the Buy Canadian movement. Local businesses began labeling products with maple leaf symbols, proudly advertising domestic origins. Restaurants promoted Canadian wines, breweries doubled down on homegrown hops, and even grocery chains reorganized aisles to feature national brands. Ordinary citizens were taking the fight into their own hands. Every purchase became a quiet protest, a declaration that economic independence mattered as much as political freedom. In the U.S., the backlash grew as well. Manufacturers, farmers, and unions demanded clarity from Washington, urging the administration to reconsider its hardline stance. They warned that tariffs meant to protect American jobs were instead destroying them. And behind closed doors, several state governors began reaching out to Ottawa directly, bypassing Washington altogether to maintain trade ties. By midsummer, pressure on the White House was mounting. Reports of layoffs, stalled shipments, and rising consumer prices filled headlines. Automakers warned of a looming production collapse. Then came the unexpected twist, a quiet proposal from Ottawa. Canadian negotiators offered to reopen discussions, but only under one condition: the complete removal of the new tariffs. Until then, border restrictions would remain in place. It was a bold move, essentially forcing Washington to make the next decision: either lift the tariffs or face a prolonged economic freeze. For Trump, the dilemma was clear. Backing down would look like weakness. Pressing forward risked a full-blown trade war. Days turned into weeks with no resolution. The standoff became the central story in global markets, a reminder that even the strongest alliances could fracture under pressure. In the end, the crisis reshaped more than trade policy. It reshaped identity. Canada had rediscovered something it had nearly forgotten: the power of economic self-determination. By standing its ground, it demonstrated that even a smaller economy could push back against global pressure when armed with strategy, unity, and conviction. The United States, meanwhile, faced a reckoning. The belief that tariffs could unilaterally reshape global trade proved costly. Instead of strengthening domestic industry, the policy had isolated American producers and strengthened their competitors abroad. The Buy Canadian model became an example for other mid-sized nations seeking independence in a world of economic giants. Months later, as the two sides finally began to ease restrictions, the world had already changed. Trade routes were redrawn, supply chains reconfigured, political alliances quietly shifted, and both Washington and Ottawa had learned that in a globalized world, power no longer comes from dominance, but from resilience. For Canada, the crisis became a defining moment, proof that independence isn't just declared, it's defended. And for the rest of the world watching, it carried a lasting message. When nations stand their ground, even superpowers must listen.